A little girl walked straight up to the most dangerous man on the beach and said, "Can I eat with you?" The whole beach went quiet, not gradually. All at once, the way sound disappears before something detonates. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman froze with her drink halfway to her mouth. Two teenagers who had been loud and careless 30 seconds ago were now very still, their instincts registering something their minds hadn't named yet. His bodyguards registered it first. They moved without being told, shoulders squaring, weight shifting forward onto the balls of their feet, hands drifting toward waistbands with the practiced casualness of men who had rehearsed that motion 10,000 times. The one closest to the blanket, a broad man named Jiho who had not smiled in 3 years, took a single step forward. Yusol raised one finger. Just one. Didn't look up, didn't raise his voice. Jiho stopped, the finger lowered, and Kang Yusol slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had never once in his adult life been surprised by anything, raised his eyes from the burner phone and looked at what had walked up to him. She was 5 years old, maybe 6. Yellow dress with thin straps at the shoulders, the fabric slightly sandy at the hem where she had been playing at the water's edge. Her hair was in braids, neat, carefully done, the kind that took time and love and a mother's patient hands on a Sunday morning. She was holding a red plastic bucket at her side and looking at him with the open, uncomplicated gaze of a child who had not yet learned that the world contained things worth being afraid of. She was the most disarming thing he had seen in 17 years of living inside rooms full of weapons. He looked at her for a long moment, then flat, final, quiet enough that only she could hear it no. She didn't move. Behind him, he felt Jiho shift again, felt the attention of the whole beach pressing in from every direction like a held breath, felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes trying very hard to look like they weren't watching. "I said no," he repeated. "I heard you," she said, and sat down anyway. She set her bucket between them, with a small, decisive thud, reached forward with both hands, and lifted a piece of fried chicken from the nearest tray with the focused deliberation of someone making an important selection. She bit into it. Her eyes went wide. She chewed thoughtfully. "You have so much food," she said, with her mouth still slightly full, "and you're not even eating it." She swallowed, remembering her manners. "My mom says food gets sad when it stays on the plate." Yusel stared at her. The burner phone sat face down on the blanket beside him, on its screen face down, hidden, but burning through the back of his awareness like a coal was a message that had arrived 11 minutes ago and that he had read 4 times since. 18. The vote is 7-2. You're out, Yusel C. Don't be there when the sun goes down. 17 years. He had built something out of nothing, had bled for it and killed for it and fed it every version of himself that had ever been soft or uncertain or afraid, and it had taken Shin Junho exactly 18 months to hollow it out from the inside and 6 words to end it. Don't be there when the sun goes down. He had been sitting on this beach for 40 minutes calculating his next move, running numbers, counting men, deciding who could be trusted and who was already turned and whether there was still a path through this that didn't end in a body his or someone else's. He had been, in the language of his world, preparing to go to war. And now there was a 5-year-old eating his chicken and telling him food had feelings. His jaw tightened. In 17 years, through coups and betrayals, and the specific cold mathematics of a life lived in shadows, nobody had ever just sat down. Not like this. Not without agenda or fear or calculation. Just sat down. She looked up at him, chewing, completely at peace. As though the most feared man in Korea was simply a person who looked like he could use some company. As though that was the only relevant fact about him. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You look like you're hurting." The question landed somewhere he hadn't known was still exposed. His thumb stopped its rhythmic tapping against the edge of the phone. The silence that followed wasn't the dangerous kind, it was the sound of a man who had been asked something simple and found, to his profound disorientation, that he did not have a ready answer. He looked away. Out at the ocean, the sun was sitting heavy and red on the horizon, bleeding into the water, the sky above it shifting through shades of orange and violet that he would have called beautiful once, a long time ago, before beauty became a thing that happened to other people. 30 meters down the beach, a woman sat on a piece of driftwood with her hands folded in her lap. She was watching him, not frantically, not with the wide-eyed alarm of a mother whose child had wandered into danger, with something far more unsettling than alarm. She was watching him with the focused, unreadable attention of someone taking very careful notes. She had not stood up once. She had not called the girl back. She was simply watching, as though she had sent the child over deliberately, as though this had been a decision rather than an accident. That bothered him more than the child did. Behind him, Aveline Vance counted the pulse visible in his neck and watched the aggressive set of his shoulders drop by 2 degrees. Watched his thumb go still. Watched the calculation in his eyes give way just briefly, just at the edges to something unguarded. The pattern interrupt had worked. She exhaled slowly. The most feared man in Korea had just forgotten, for one unguarded moment, to be dangerous. She stood, brushed sand from her jeans, and began walking toward him. She had sent her daughter in first because monsters never see the negotiator coming. Nobody moved for a long moment. The beach held its collective breath, that particular suspended stillness of bystanders who have witnessed something they cannot categorize and are waiting for someone else to decide what it means. A couple 3 blankets over sat rigidly side by side, their earlier argument forgotten, their eyes fixed carefully on the middle distance in the practiced way of people pretending very hard not to watch. A vendor who had been making his way down the shoreline with a cooler full of drinks had stopped walking entirely. He stood 30 feet away, cooler handle in both hands, going absolutely nowhere. Yusol was aware of all of it. He was always aware of all of it. What he was less prepared for was being aware of none of it mattering. The girl had finished her first piece of chicken and was surveying the remaining trays with the systematic focus of a general reviewing terrain. She moved a container of rice slightly to the left to get a better look at what was behind it, then nodded to herself as though confirming something she had suspected. "That's enough," Yusol said. She stopped, looked at him. Her hand, which had been drifting toward a piece of sushi, withdrew itself slowly. She put it back. He watched her do it. Watched her fold her hands in her lap with the composed, unhurried dignity of someone who had been raised to accept no gracefully. No argument, no performance, just okay. "Okay," she said. He picked up his chopsticks, set them down again. In the silence that followed, he became aware that the thing he had been feeling since her question, "Are you okay? You look like you're hurting," had not gone away simply because he had looked at the ocean. It sat in his chest like a splinter, small and specific and deeply inconvenient. He was not accustomed to inconvenient feelings. He had spent the better part of 2 decades building infrastructure specifically designed to prevent them. "Where did you come from?" he asked. It came out more directly than he intended, not hostile, just stripped of the usual social scaffolding he didn't bother with anymore. She didn't seem to mind. "America," she said, "but we live here now." She said it with the easy authority of a child who is fully committed to a new chapter. "My mom teaches English. She says Korea is the best decision she ever made." A pause. "She says that about most things we do, though. Your mother sounds decisive. She says if you're going to choose something, you should choose it all the way." She considered this. "I think that's right." He looked at the spread of food in front of him. 12 trays, ordered without appetite 2 hours ago at a restaurant nearby, and transported here because he had needed to be outside rather than in a room with walls closing in, which was not a thing he would have admitted to anyone alive. "Did you make all this yourself?" she asked. "No." "Who made it?" "People who work for me." She received this information seriously. "My mom makes our food herself. She says cooking for someone is the same as telling them you love them." Her gaze moved across the untouched trays with an expression that was almost diagnostic. "Did the people who made this love you?" The question detonated somewhere quiet. He stared at her. She looked back at him with complete equanimity, apparently unaware that she had just dismantled a question he had been avoiding for most of his adult life, with the casual precision of someone removing a splinter. The people who had made this food were employees, subordinates, men and women who followed his instructions because the alternative carried consequences. They had prepared 12 trays of food for a man who hadn't touched any of it because they were paid to, because they were afraid not to, because in his world compliance and loyalty had long since become interchangeable words for the same transaction. Did they love him? He genuinely did not know. He had genuinely never wondered. "Eat your chicken," he said. She brightened immediately, as though he had said something generous, and reached back into the tray with renewed enthusiasm. He heard the footsteps before he saw her. Soft and measured, the deliberate unhurry of someone controlling their pace with precision. His body registered her approach the way it registered all movement in his periphery as data to be assessed. Threat level calculated, response prepared. But even as his instincts ran that process, they came back with something unexpected. Not a threat. Something else entirely. He looked up. She had stopped at a respectful distance from the blanket, close enough to be present, far enough to communicate that she understood the geometry of the situation and was observing it. Tall, with the kind of composed stillness that didn't come from temperament, but from training the specific physical grammar of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space they intended and no more. She looked at her daughter first. That look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, a rapid, practiced assessment that moved from the top of the girl's head to the soles of her feet and back again with the efficiency of someone who had been checking people for injury for a very long time. Satisfied, she looked at Yusel, and something happened that almost never happened to him. He felt assessed, not threatened, not challenged. Assessed the way a doctor looks at a patient, the way a navigator looks at weather, the way someone looks at a thing they need to understand before they decide what to do about it. Her eyes moved across his face with a calm, unhurried intelligence that cataloged everything they found without reacting to any of it. He had looked into the eyes of dangerous people his entire adult life. He knew what threat looked like from every angle. He knew the particular quality of attention that precedes violence. This wasn't that. This was something he had less vocabulary for. Something quieter and, he was beginning to suspect, considerably more dangerous in ways he hadn't mapped yet. "I'm sorry if she bothered you," she said. Her Korean was accented but precise, the precision of someone who had learned it with serious intent rather than convenience. "She didn't," he said. He hadn't decided to say it. It simply came out honest and unguarded in a way that would have irritated him under other circumstances. He saw her register it, saw the fractional shift in her expression that wasn't quite surprise but was something adjacent to confirmation, as though she had predicted this answer and was noting that she'd been right. That was the moment he understood he was dealing with someone who had been running calculations on him since before they'd ever been introduced. Camille. Her voice was gentle and absolute, at once the voice of a woman who never needed to raise it. "What do we say?" The girl Camille stood up and bowed her head with a gravity that was almost formal, the bow of a child who had been taught that courtesy was not performance but substance. "Thank you for sharing your food," she said. "She took it," Yusel said. "I didn't share it." Camille looked up at him with unimpressed calm. "You didn't say no the second time." He opened his mouth, closed it. The woman's lips pressed together, not quite a smile, but the precise shape that a smile makes before it decides whether to arrive. She looked at him over her daughter's head with an expression he was finding increasingly difficult to read and said, "May I?" with a small gesture toward the edge of the blanket. Every operational instinct he had said no. Shin's people could be on this beach right now, sitting here having a conversation with civilians while a coup assembled itself in real time, was precisely the kind of lapse in judgment that got people killed. He had 3 missed calls from his second lieutenant. He had decisions to make that required cold clarity and no distractions. She was looking at him with those unreadable eyes, and he was acutely aware that the most dangerous thing about her was not anything she had said or done. It was the specific quality of her attention, the sense that she was seeing him in a way that went past the suit and the tattoos and the carefully constructed architecture of everything he had built around himself. "Sit," he said. She sat straight-backed, hands resting open on her knees, a posture that managed to communicate both ease and complete readiness simultaneously. She looked out at the ocean for a moment, as though giving him time to adjust to her presence, and then back at him. "Aveline Vance," she said. "I didn't ask." "I know." The corner of her mouth moved. "I offered." Camille had already resettled herself between them, a small, warm presence wedged into the space, as though she had been specifically designed to occupy exactly that gap, and was sorting the fruit tray with intense concentration, moving the melon pieces into one section and the strawberries into another, with the systematic satisfaction of someone who found disorder genuinely offensive. Yusol looked at Aveline. "You let her walk over here alone," he said. "Yes. You weren't afraid of what I might do?" "No. Why not?" She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone searching for an answer, but of someone deciding how much of the truth this moment required. "Because I watched you for 10 minutes before she moved," she said, "and I saw a man who was exhausted." She paused precisely, deliberately, the pause of someone who chooses their words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Dangerous men who are exhausted don't want more chaos. They want one quiet moment. She met his eyes directly. "You looked like a man who hadn't had one in a very long time." The ocean moved. The sun pressed lower. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed at something, and the sound drifted past like it belonged to a different world entirely. "You don't know anything about me," he said, flat, final, the voice that ended things. "No," she agreed, easily and without apology. "I don't." She reached over, selected a piece of sushi from the nearest tray, and ate it with the unhurried composure of a woman who had shared meals in rooms considerably more dangerous than this one. He watched her do it and felt against all reason, against 17 years of carefully maintained emotional architecture, the faint, involuntary pull of wanting to know what those rooms had been. He looked away. "My mom said you look sad," Camille announced to the general atmosphere, still sorting fruit. On the walk over, she said, "He looks like a man who hasn't had a real meal in a very long time." She looked up at Yisol with the earnest directness of someone delivering important news. "Not food. A real meal. She says there's a difference." He turned to look at Aveline. She looked back at him with perfect composure and said nothing, offered nothing, simply held his gaze with that calm, direct attention and let the silence sit between them like a table neither of them had agreed to sit at and neither of them was leaving. He picked up his chopsticks. He looked at the food that had been sitting in front of him for 40 minutes, while he catalogued betrayals and calculated survival odds. He lifted a piece of chicken and ate it. It was, despite everything, very good. Camille clapped once sharp, delighted, the clap of someone whose hypothesis has just been proven correct. "See?" she said, reaching for a strawberry with tremendous satisfaction. "My mom's always right." The sky above them had gone from gold to deep violet, the last fire of the sun swallowed by the sea. Below it, the water caught the last of the light in long broken lines that moved and shifted and didn't hold their shape. Somewhere in the city behind him, Shin was moving. People were being called. Positions were being taken. And Kang Yisol was eating fried chicken on a beach blanket between a 5-year-old who sorted fruit by color and a woman who watched him like she was reading a language he hadn't known he was speaking. He should leave. He knew he should leave. He ate another piece instead. "Your Korean is good," he said to Aveline. It came out quieter than he intended, almost though he would not have called it this conversational. "Thank you," she said. A pause. The waves came in. The waves went out. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She turned to look at him, then fully, directly, with something in her expression that was close to amusement, and closer still to something he couldn't name. Something that was aware of itself being looked at and was not uncomfortable with it. "Long enough," she said. The words hung between them in the cooling air. He didn't press further. She didn't elaborate. But in the particular quality of the silence that followed unhurried, neither of them moving to fill it, something shifted between them that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with its opposite. He noticed it. From the angle of her stillness, so did she. Neither of them said anything about it. The ocean kept moving. The sky kept darkening. Camille finished sorting the fruit and began, with great seriousness, on the rice. They heard it before they saw it. A sharp, clean crack, not thunder, not a car backfiring, not any of the ordinary sounds a city makes going about its business. Something precise and deliberate and final. The specific acoustic signature of a suppressed rifle. The sound that remains after everything loud has been engineered out of it, leaving only the essential fact of the thing. Yisol was already moving before the echo finished. Not thinking, not deciding. His body made the calculation and executed it in the same instant. 17 years of survival, compressed into pure reflex. He dropped the chopsticks, pivoted across the blanket, and covered Camille with his full weight in a single fluid motion that was almost gentle in its precision. One arm hooked around her, pulling her flat against the sand. His other hand was at his back, fingers closing around the grip of the weapon holstered there, eyes already scanning tree line, elevated road, rooftop, angle of approach. Camille made a small sound. Surprise, not pain. He registered the difference immediately. Sand erupted 3 inches from where her knee had been a second ago. 3 inches. He felt something move through him that was not fear. He had long since burned fear out of himself, but was in the same neighborhood. Something cold and absolute and entirely focused on the small body he had just pulled against his chest. Down. He didn't look at Aveline. He didn't need to. She was already flat, already moving low and fast, no wasted motion, pulling herself toward Camille the moment his grip shifted to give her access. Not scrambling, not panicking, moving with the controlled economy of someone who had practiced getting low in dangerous places and had not forgotten how. He filed that away. This was not the first time tonight she had moved like that. His men were converging from both directions along the beach, Jiho from the left, 2 others from the right. A 4th breaking from the tree line above where he had been positioned as overwatch. Weapons drawn. Scanning. Jiho got to them first, and dropped into a crouch between Yisol and the elevated road above the shore, making himself a wall with the matter-of-fact commitment of a man who understood that this was the function he served. "1 shot, Jiho said, low and rapid. "Elevated position, north end of the access road. Shooter is mobile, he's already moving. Direction? East. On foot." Yisol processed this in the space of a breath. Single shot from an elevated mobile position. Suppressed. Not a spray, a placement shot, carefully aimed. This wasn't a panicked ambush. This was a professional who had set up, taken his shot, and was already extracting. The shot had missed. by 3 inches. Shin's people didn't miss by accident. They missed because something had changed in the last second before the trigger was pulled, the target had shifted, the angle had altered. Something had moved in the frame that hadn't been there during the setup. He looked down. Camille had moved. She had leaned forward to reach for something in the fruit tray. Approximately 4 seconds before the shot, he could see the displaced sand where her knee had tracked forward. The shooter had been zeroed on a static position that had changed at the last possible moment. A 5-year-old reaching for a strawberry had saved his life. He became aware that he was still covering her, his body curved over hers, her face pressed against his chest, her breathing fast and shallow against his shirt. He felt her hands, both of them gripping the fabric of his jacket with a strength that surprised him for someone her size. She was not crying. That surprised him more. He pulled back enough to look at her. Her eyes were wide and her lower lip was pressed tight, and she was breathing through her nose in the controlled, deliberate way of a child who had decided she was not going to cry and was executing that decision through sheer force of will. Something about that precision, that small, dignified refusal to come apart, hit him somewhere unprotected. "Look at me," he said. Quiet, direct. She looked at him. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Once. Firm. Good." He held her gaze for 1 more second, steady, certain, communicating the specific thing that needed to be communicated without words, and watched her breathing slow by a fraction. Then he straightened and looked at Jiho. "We need to move. Now. Back route to the car park. Already called it in. Tay has the vehicle running. Civilian cover? Beach is clearing. Nobody saw the impact point. Keep it that way." He stood and turned. Aveline was already on her feet. She had Camille against her hip. The girl had transferred her grip from his jacket to her mother's without a sound, and she was doing the same rapid environmental scan he had just done, her eyes moving across the beach in the systematic pattern of someone assessing vectors and exits and threat angles. She caught him watching her do it, and for one brief moment something passed between them, recognition, mutual and unspoken. The specific acknowledgement of 2 people who have just confirmed something about each other that changes the shape of the room. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. "Stay close," he said. "Don't stop moving. If I tell you to get down, you get down immediately. You don't ask why." "Understood," she said. No hesitation, no questions. He looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned and moved. They went up the beach access steps fast and low, Yisol in front, Jiho behind, Aveline keeping pace between them, with Camille held close and her head down. The remaining 2 men flanked wide, covering the tree line. Nobody spoke. The evening air was cool against his face, and he could feel the precise mechanical focus settling over him, the narrowing of attention that happened when the world reduced itself to the immediate problem of survival. He had lived inside that focus for years. It was the most familiar state he knew. What was less familiar was the awareness running alongside it, acute and unwanted, of the woman moving 3 feet behind him. The sound of her breathing, the controlled rhythm of it, the fact that she was keeping pace without being told to, reading the movement without instruction, anticipating the gaps and the turns with an accuracy that had nothing to do with luck. He had moved through dangerous situations with trained professionals. He knew what that looked like. This was that. Tay had the car running at the top of the access road, a dark vehicle with tinted windows, engine already warm, positioned for immediate movement. He had the rear door open before they reached it. Yisol pulled it wide and turned. Aveline was right behind him. She met his eyes as she ducked into the car, and he saw something in them that he hadn't expected, not gratitude, not relief, not the wide-eyed shock that most people carried out of situations like this. Something steadier. Something that looked, if he was being precise about it, like controlled anger. The cold, focused fury of a woman who had been caught in someone else's crossfire and was already calculating what to do about it. He got in after her and pulled the door shut. Tay had them moving before it closed. The city absorbed them immediately, the indifferent machinery of evening traffic closing around the car like water around a stone. Lit storefronts. Pedestrians with nowhere urgent to be. A normal Thursday night in Seoul that had no idea what had just happened on a beach 3 kilometers behind them. Nobody spoke for the first several minutes. Yisol sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at nothing and ran the numbers. 1 shooter, professional, mobile, extracted clean, which meant Shin had moved faster than the timeline suggested, which meant either the council vote had been the signal, or Shin had people watching Yisol's movements independently and had seen an opportunity, which meant the safe house timeline had just compressed significantly, and every hour he spent not moving was an hour Shin was using to close the net. He needed to think. He needed to be alone and cold and purely analytical, and he needed every emotional variable out of the room. He was in a car with a child and a woman he couldn't stop being aware of, and neither of those things showed any signs of leaving. "She needs water," Aveline said. He pressed the intercom. "Water, back seat." Tay passed a bottle through without a word. Aveline opened it and held it for Camille, who drank with the serious focus of someone following instructions, then sat up slightly and looked around the car with the careful attention of a child taking inventory. She looked at Yisol. "That was a gun," she said. "Yes." "Somebody tried to shoot you." "Yes." She absorbed this. He watched her process it, the small frown, the slight press of her lips, the particular gravity of a child confronting a fact that doesn't fit neatly into the world as they understand it. "Because of your job," she said, not quite a question. "Yes, because of my job." She was quiet for a moment. Her hand found her mother's and held it, not frantically, just steadily, the grip of someone anchoring themselves. "My mom says some jobs cost too much," she said. Her voice was smaller than it had been on the beach, not frightened, subdued, the specific quiet of a child who is being careful with something. "She left her old job because it cost too much." She looked up at him. "What does your job cost?" The car moved through the city. Outside the window, a man was stacking crates at a fruit stall with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had done it 10,000 times. A woman walked past holding a child's hand. A couple stood in a doorway arguing about something small and temporary and completely survivable. Ordinary things. The texture of a life that had existed entirely outside his world for so long he had forgotten what it looked like from the inside. "Everything," he said. The word came out quietly, more honest than he intended, stripped of the deliberate flatness he usually applied to things he didn't want to examine. "It costs everything." Camille looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the seat and placed her small hand over his, the one resting against his knee, the one with the scar across the second knuckle from a night in Busan 8 years ago that he never thought about anymore. She didn't say anything, just set her hand there and left it warm and light, and entirely without condition. He looked down at it, the scar, her hand over it, the specific smallness of her fingers against his. Something moved through him deep and slow, like a fault line shifting, and he recognized it distantly. The way you recognize a language you once knew and have spent years forgetting. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't sentiment. Or not only that. It was the specific and exquisite pain of a man being reminded that he had once been someone to whom a child's hand on his would have seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He had buried that person so thoroughly he had stopped being aware of the grave. He turned to the window. Aveline watched the muscle in his jaw tighten and release. She had been watching him since the moment the shot fired, cataloging his responses, mapping his patterns, building the picture with the quiet, methodical discipline of someone for whom reading people under pressure was not a skill but a survival mechanism. What she was finding complicated her. She had come into this situation with a clear tactical objective: interrupt a pattern, prevent a violent incident in a crowded public space, extract without damage. She had executed the objective. She had sent Camille in because a child disarms in ways that nothing else does. Because the specific cognitive interruption of innocence encountering danger creates a gap in aggression that a trained negotiator can work with. Because she had assessed Kang Yusol from 30 meters away and read a man who was closer to the edge than anyone around him understood. She had been right about all of it. What she hadn't accounted for, what she was accounting for now, in the back of a moving car with her daughter's hand in hers, and the most feared man in Korea, 6 inches to her left, was the specific texture of who he was when the architecture cracked. The way he had covered Camille. Not calculated, not performed instinctive and immediate and disproportionate in its care. The way he had checked her for injury before he had done anything else. The way his voice had gone quiet and direct and completely steady because a child needed it to be. She had read his baseline. She had predicted his responses. She had not predicted that. She was revising. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. He was looking out the window still. His jaw had released. His voice had returned to its usual register, controlled and flat and giving nothing away. The wall had come back up. She noted how quickly it had come back up. She noted more carefully how completely it had come down. "My daughter will need to sleep soon," she said. "There are beds. And tomorrow?" He turned from the window then, and looked at her directly, the first time since the car had started moving. In the dim light of the city sliding past the windows, his eyes were dark and unreadable, and carrying the particular weight of a man holding a very large number of things at once. "Tomorrow depends on tonight," he said. She held his gaze. "Then we'd better make good use of tonight." Something moved in his expression, brief and controlled, and almost nothing. Almost. He looked away first. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, bright and indifferent, entirely unaware that in the back of a dark car moving through its streets, 3 people were negotiating the terms of something none of them had names for yet. Camille had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her red bucket clutched in both hands even in sleep, her face finally smooth and unguarded and completely at peace. Yisol looked at her once. Just once. Then he looked out the window and kept his face very still, and did not look at Aveline again for the rest of the drive. But he was aware of her the entire way. Every single kilometer. The safe house was in Mapogu. From the outside it was nothing. A narrow 4-story building pressed between a laundromat whose sign flickered on the left, and a pharmacy that had been closed for renovation on the right, for what appeared to be several months, based on the dust accumulation on the gate. The street it sat on was the kind of street that existed in every city, functional, unmemorable, the urban equivalent of a held breath, a street that people passed through rather than arrived at. That was the point. Tay pulled into the narrow alley behind the building and cut the engine. Nobody moved for a moment. Old habit, you sat with the silence first, let the environment speak, made sure the arrival had gone unobserved. 30 seconds. Nothing moved, no lights in the windows above, no parked cars that hadn't been there when the location was last swept 6 days ago. Clear? Jiho said from the front passenger seat. They moved. Inside was different from outside in the way that mattered, not luxurious, not comfortable in any conventional sense, but precise. Everything in it had been chosen for function. Reinforced doors with 3 separate locking mechanisms. Windows that were thicker than they looked and treated against both impact and surveillance. A kitchen that was stocked in the way a field hospital is stocked, not for pleasure, but for the sustained operational requirement of people who needed to remain functional under pressure. 3 bedrooms. A room at the back that didn't appear on the building's original plans. Yisol had used this place 4 times in 9 years. Never for longer than 48 hours. Never with anyone who wasn't already so deep inside his world that the distinction between them and the darkness was largely academic. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Tay move through the rooms with quiet efficiency, checking corners, windows, the back exit, the places where threat announces itself before it arrives. Aveline was in the main room with Camille, speaking to her in low English that Yisol caught fragments of without being able to assemble meaning from them. Something reassuring, something steady and unhurried and deliberately calm. He found himself listening to the tone of it even when he couldn't follow the words. Camille had been awake when they brought her inside, blinking, slightly dazed, holding her bucket with the grip of someone maintaining contact with something familiar in an unfamiliar place. She had looked at the safe house the way children look at new environments, systematically, without judgment, cataloging rather than evaluating. She had looked at Yisol once from across the room with an expression he couldn't immediately name, and then looked at her mother, and then allowed herself to be settled on the couch, with a blanket that Aveline had found in a closet, and shaken out without being asked. That was 20 minutes ago. Now, Camille's eyes were losing the battle they had been fighting since the car. Her body had decided that enough had happened today, and was enforcing a conclusion regardless of her preference. Her head drooped once against the back of the couch. She caught it, drooped again. "Stay," she said to Yisol. The word came out slightly blurred at the edges with exhaustion, but the intent behind it was perfectly clear. He was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. He looked at her from across the space, this small person who had sat down, uninvited, and changed the geometry of his evening, and was now demanding his continued presence with the simple authority of someone who had decided he was hers to make demands of. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Promise." He looked at her. At the bucket still loosely held in her hands. At the braids that had come slightly undone on one side from the events of the evening. At the absolute trust in her face that was so unearned and so complete it was almost unbearable to look at directly. "I'll be in the next room," he said. She considered this. The negotiation was brief, and conducted entirely in her expression. He watched her weigh his offer against her requirement, and arrive at a conclusion. "Okay," she said, and her eyes closed. Within 2 minutes her breathing had gone slow and even and completely surrendered. Aveline sat with her hand resting lightly on Camille's back until she was certain, then withdrew it carefully and stood. She looked at Yisol across the room. He looked back. The space between them was perhaps 4 meters and felt like considerably less. She walked to the kitchen. He moved aside to let her through, and she passed close enough that he caught briefly, involuntarily, the faint scent of salt and something warmer underneath it, the residue of an evening that had started on a beach and had not gone the direction either of them had planned. She stopped on the far side of the kitchen counter and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at him. "Talk," she said. He had a system for this, for the moments when information needed to be shared, and the sharing of it required careful calibration. You gave what was necessary, you held what wasn't. You maintained the boundary between operational clarity and vulnerability, because the second you let those two things blur, you had handed someone a map to everything inside you, and most people, in his experience, used maps like that eventually. He looked at Aveline Vance on the other side of his kitchen counter. He thought about the way she had moved on the beach, in the car, through the door of this building. He thought about the way she had sat on the driftwood and watched him, not with fear, not with curiosity, but with the focused analytical patience of someone running a very specific kind of assessment. He gave her everything. "His name is Shin Junhyu," he said. "My underboss. 9 years. He has been with me since before the syndicate had a name anyone outside 3 city blocks would recognize." He paused, not for effect, but because stating it out loud required something from him he hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks ago I found out he had been running a parallel operation inside mine, skimming accounts, funneling the money through shell companies into legitimate businesses, building a structure that would survive and operate independently of the syndicate. He was building an exit, Aveline said. Not just an exit, a replacement. He wasn't trying to take my position, he was trying to make my position irrelevant, become something the council couldn't touch, and I couldn't dismantle. He paused again. I began building a case against him quietly, gathering documentation, moving certain assets out of his reach without making it visible. A beat. He found out before I was ready. "The vote," she said. 7-2. The Elder Council governs the syndicate. Final authority on leadership disputes, resource allocation, rules of engagement. Shin went to them first, presented a version of events that positioned me as unstable, a liability, a threat to the syndicate's long-term viability. His voice remained flat throughout. He had learned long ago that the way to survive information like this was to present it as data rather than experience. 7 of the 9 council members voted to strip my authority pending investigation. Investigation that Shin controls the narrative of. That he was controlling. Yes. He looked at her. Tonight on the beach was him moving before I could counter. He needed me gone before I could present the documentation I had gathered before the council heard my version. Aveline absorbed this with the focused stillness of someone building a model in real time. He watched her do it, watched her take each piece and place it, and test its relationship to the pieces already placed, and felt the peculiar and entirely unwelcome sensation of being impressed. "The shot was a message," she said. "Not just an attempt. Both. If the shooter had connected, the message was unnecessary. When he missed, he paused. I'm still here, still able to move, which means Shin needs to accelerate whatever comes next. How long do you have? Before he tries again? Hours. Before he finds this location, if his intelligence is as good as tonight suggested, perhaps less." He paused. "I have men I trust. 6 of them, including Tae. Against whatever Shin can mobilize in the next 12 hours, that is not a comfortable margin." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. He could see it the way her eyes went slightly inward, the particular quality of her stillness when she was processing rather than simply waiting. "Why were we targeted?" she asked. "Specifically. Not why was the shot taken, I understand that. Why were Camille and I on his map at all?" He had been waiting for this question. He had been thinking about the answer since the moment the bullet hit the sand. "Shin is methodical," he said. "He doesn't move on impulse, and he doesn't create variables he hasn't accounted for. If his shooter had a sightline to Camille tonight, it's because Shin put her in that sightline deliberately." He paused. He had been watching my movements for weeks before the vote. At some point he saw Camille sit down. He saw me not send her away. His jaw tightened briefly. He saw something he could use. The words landed in the kitchen like stones. Aveline's hands, still flat on the counter, pressed slightly harder against the surface. It was the only visible reaction, that small increase of pressure. Her face remained composed, but her eyes went to a place that was cold and very focused, and had nothing gentle in it at all. "He was holding us as leverage," she said, waiting for the optimal moment. "Yes, tonight that moment arrived ahead of his preferred schedule, because of where I was, and what I was doing, and the fact that a clean shot presented itself." He looked at her directly. Being on that beach was not a coincidence from his perspective. You were already a variable in his planning. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a woman processing the information that her child had been a calculated instrument in someone else's strategy. He watched her move through it, watched the cold fury rise and be contained and be filed, Not suppressed, but stored, the way a professional stores things that require a response rather than a reaction. "Tell me about the Elder Council," she said. Her voice was completely even, he told her. "The council's structure, its authority, the rules of engagement that even Shin couldn't violate without consequences, the black ledgers that documented 15 years of syndicate finances and that would, if placed before the council with the right context, dismantle Shin's position entirely. The 48 hours he needed to retrieve and present them. Where are the ledgers?" she asked. "Secured. Off-site. A location only I know. Can you get to them without being seen?" "With the right timing, yes. Then that's the priority." She looked at him steadily. Not the 6 men against however many. Not the direct confrontation. "The ledgers. I know what the priority is," he said. Evenly, not sharp, but with the specific firmness of a man who was not accustomed to being strategized at. She looked at him and something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The shape of one, the acknowledgement that she had heard the tone and was noting it without being deterred by it. "Then we agree," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. "You're very calm," he said. "For someone who just had a bullet land 3 inches from her daughter." "I'm calm because my daughter is asleep in the next room and she needs me to be," she said. The words were straightforward. Without performance, the plain statement of a woman who had decided long ago what she owed the people she loved. "I'll be whatever else I need to be later." He said nothing. She straightened up from the counter and something shifted in her posture, a fraction of the held tension releasing. Almost imperceptible. The kind of thing you only noticed if you had been watching very carefully, which he had been. "How much do you know about me?" she asked. The question was direct and without particular inflection, not accusatory, not anxious, just precise. "Your name, your daughter's name, that you teach English, that your Korean is too good and your crisis instincts are too practiced for the biography you've offered." He paused. "That you sent Camille over to me deliberately." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. She said it without flinching, without apology or deflection, with the clean directness of someone who had decided honesty was the correct tactical choice. "I did." "Why?" "Because you were going to do something," she said. "In that restaurant, at that table, with that phone in your hand, you were going to make a decision that you couldn't take back. And a crowded public space full of civilians was going to be involved in the consequences." She held his gaze. "I've been in rooms with men making that specific decision often enough to recognize it from 30 meters. The kitchen was very still. "You interrupted it," he said. "Camille interrupted it. I just pointed her in the right direction." Something moved in his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else, an involuntary response he controlled almost immediately. "Almost. That was a significant risk," he said. "With your daughter?" "I assessed the risk," she said. "I wouldn't have sent her if I thought the outcome would be anything other than what it was." "You were that certain?" "I was that certain," she said, without arrogance, just with the calm self-possession of a woman who trusted her own assessments. He looked at her across the kitchen for a long moment, at the composed face and the steady eyes and the hands that had stopped pressing against the counter and were now resting easily at her sides. At the woman who had sent her 5-year-old daughter toward the most dangerous man in the city because she had read him at 30 meters and trusted the reading. "Who are you?" he asked, quietly, the second time tonight, but different this time, less operational, less analytical, closer to something genuine. She held his gaze. "Someone who has been in rooms like this before," she said, "and survived them." She moved toward the doorway. "There's one more thing," he said. She stopped. "The community space in Mapogu. The building that houses your English classes." He kept his voice level. "Shin has a shell company that acquired it 8 months ago. He's been planning to use it." He watched her absorb this, watched her understand what use it meant. "My students," she said. 43 families that use that building. He would move against it to send a message. He paused. "You need to clear them, quietly, in the morning." She turned to face him fully. Her expression was composed entirely, deliberately composed, but underneath it, he could feel the temperature of something cold and absolute, the fury of a woman who had built something good and was being told it had been targeted before she ever knew the danger existed. "I'll clear them," she said. Her voice was measured steel. "All of them. It has to look routine. If Shin sees the pattern, he'll accelerate." "I understand routine," she said. He believed her completely. She was almost through the door when she stopped and turned back without fully turning a 3/4 profile, her face half in shadow. the particular posture of someone delivering something they have decided to give. "She likes you," she said. Her voice had changed, the steel still present, but something warmer running alongside it now. "Camille, she told me in the car while you weren't listening." A pause. "She said you have sad eyes but a safe face." Another pause, smaller. "She has never once been wrong about a person." The words landed somewhere he hadn't prepared for. He stood with them in the kitchen after she had gone, stood with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the city outside, and the even breathing of a child in the next room who had placed her hand over his scarred knuckles in the back of a moving car and asked nothing in return. He looked at his hands. Not at the scars, he had looked at those enough times to have stopped seeing them, at the hands themselves, the shape of them, what they had done and what they had built, and what they had cost the people who had been in the way of the building. He had not looked at his hands like this in a very long time. He sat down at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop. He began to follow the money. Outside the safe house window, Mapogu breathed its quiet nighttime breath, the laundromat dark. The pharmacy shuttered, the street doing what it did, which was nothing, which was everything, which was simply continuing. The city did not know what was happening inside its narrow buildings. It never did. It just kept going, lights and traffic, and the ordinary persistence of people getting through their days, indifferent and continuous, and he was beginning to understand, in ways he had never adequately considered, worth protecting. He didn't sleep. The laptop screen was the only light in the kitchen by 2 a.m, casting everything in cold blue, while the rest of the safe house breathed quietly around him. Tay had taken a position near the front door. The others were outside in rotating shifts. The building was as secure as it was going to get. Yizol didn't notice any of it. He was following the money. Shin hadn't just been skimming. That had been the surface, the thing visible enough to find if you knew where to look. Underneath it was something else entirely. 18 months of careful, patient construction syndicate funds moving through shell companies, like water finding its level. Each transfer clean, each destination legitimate on paper. Restaurants, a logistics company in Incheon, a private security firm whose clients included 3 members of the Elder Council. He sat back. That last detail sat in the room like something with weight. Shin hadn't just been buying an exit. He had been buying protection. By the time Yisol had gathered enough to move against him, Shin would have had 3 council members whose financial interests were quietly tied to his survival. The investigation would have stalled. The evidence would have been questioned. And Yisol would have found himself outmaneuvered, not with weapons, but with paperwork. Smart, patient, surgical. He would have admired it if it hadn't been aimed at his throat. He followed one more thread, a community development fund registered 8 months ago, moving through property acquisitions in Mapo-gu and Yongsan. Residential buildings, a youth center, a community space offering free English classes. He pulled up the tenant records. Aveline Vance, lead instructor. He stared at the screen. Shin had known about her for months. Not because of the beach had simply been the moment he decided to convert a background variable into an active one. She had been on his map long before Camille ever sat down on that blanket. He had been building toward using her, waiting for the precise moment when deploying that particular pressure would cause the maximum damage. Last night, that moment had arrived. He knocked on her door at 3:15. One quiet knock. He half expected silence, expected to have to knock again or wait. "I'm awake," she said immediately. He opened the door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her phone face up beside her, her posture carrying the particular alertness of someone who had not slept and had not intended to. She looked at his face and was on her feet before he spoke. "What happened?" He turned the laptop toward her. She read standing up, one hand braced lightly on the doorframe. He watched her move through the document, the tightening at the corners of her eyes, the jaw that set itself and held. When she reached her name in the tenant record, she went completely still. 3 months, she said. At minimum. Possibly longer. She set the laptop on the dresser. Stood with her back to him, hands flat on the surface, head slightly bowed. He gave her the silence. He had learned recently, in the last several hours, that she used silence the way most people used words. Productively. With intent. When she turned back, her face was composed. But underneath it, something burned cold and contained and absolute. Not fear. Never fear with this woman. The fury of someone who had built something with her hands and was being told it had been marked before she ever knew to protect it. "The family's in that building," she said. "I know. Children come there every morning. I know." He held her gaze. "Shin would burn it not for the building, but for the message. Anyone still loyal to me needs to understand the cost of that loyalty." He paused. You became that message the moment Camille sat down. The words landed between them with the specific weight of things that cannot be unsaid. She absorbed it, filed it, moved forward. I'll clear the building by morning, she said. All 43 families. It will look like a routine inspection. She paused. He won't see it coming. No, Yisul said quietly. He won't. She looked at him for a long moment, steadily, with that particular attention that catalogued everything it found. Then something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly. Opened fractionally, briefly, like a door moved by something passing. She told me something else, Aveline said. In the car, when you were looking out the window. A pause. She said, I want to help him not be sad anymore. She said it like it was a project she had already decided to take on. He said nothing. I thought you should know, she said simply. What you mean to her. Already. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he walked back to the kitchen, sat down, and kept following the money until the city outside the window began its slow gray return to morning. Morning arrived without announcement. One moment the kitchen window held darkness, and the next it held gray, the slow, reluctant light of a city remembering itself after night. Yisul had been awake through all of it. He had watched the darkness thin by degrees the way he had watched many things in his life without sentiment, without impatience, simply noting the change as it occurred. He heard her before she appeared. Quiet footsteps, unhurried. The particular cadence of someone who had also been awake and was not pretending otherwise. Aveline came into the kitchen, looked at the laptop, the cold coffee, the document open on the screen, and said nothing about any of it. She moved to the stove, found a pot, filled it with water, and set it on the burner with the matter-of-fact ease of someone making themselves at home in a space that wasn't theirs, not presumptuous, just practical. A woman who had learned that comfort was something you created, rather than waited to be offered. He watched her do it. She had her hair down this morning. Yesterday it had been pulled back, controlled, contained, the professional arrangement of a woman who was always slightly on duty. This was different. Softer. He noted the difference and looked away before she could catch him noting it. She made coffee, set a cup in front of him without asking, sat down across the table. They sat in silence for a moment, the specific silence of two people who had been through something together and were taking stock of what the morning had left them with. The families are cleared, she said. He looked up. I made the calls at 6. She wrapped both hands around her cup, told each of them the building had been flagged for a routine safety inspection. Temporary closure, 1 week. The supervisor will spend the morning trying to verify the filing. The corner of her mouth moved. By the time he realizes there isn't one, it won't matter. All 43, she confirmed. There was one family I had to call twice. A grandmother who runs an after-school program on the 3rd floor. She takes her schedule very seriously. Something warm moved through her voice. I told her the inspector had specifically commended the program, and she accepted the closure without further objection. He looked at her across the table, at the composed face and the slight warmth still present from the mention of the grandmother, at the woman who had been awake since before dawn, protecting 43 families from a threat they didn't know existed, using nothing but her voice and the trust she had spent months building. You built something real there, he said. She looked at him. Yes, they trusted you immediately. No questions. That's what real trust does, she said. It holds without explanation. She paused. It takes a long time to build. You can't manufacture it, and you can't buy it. Her eyes were steady on his. It's the only kind of power that doesn't require someone else to be afraid of you. The words sat between them with the particular weight of things said simply that carry enormous freight. Camille appeared at the kitchen doorway at 7:45, wearing her yellow dress with the focused expression of someone who had slept well and had plans. She looked at both of them, assessed the situation. Is there breakfast? She asked. Yisul looked at the kitchen. There are eggs. Camille looked at him with patient expectation. I don't cook, he said. I know, she said. That's okay. She looked at her mother. Aveline was already moving. What followed was something Yisul observed with the careful attention he usually reserved for threat assessment, because he was slowly understanding its own kind of disarmament. Aveline moved through the unfamiliar kitchen without hesitation, finding things by logic rather than familiarity, opening the cabinet most likely to hold a pan, checking the second drawer for utensils, working with whatever the space offered rather than requiring it to be anything other than what it was. Within 20 minutes there were scrambled eggs, toast from bread that was slightly stale but serviceable, and sliced fruit from a bag she had packed before leaving the beach the previous evening. Yisul stared at the fruit bag. You packed before a potential crisis situation, he said. I always have a bag, she said, setting plates on the table. Sit down. He sat. Camille climbed into the chair beside him, examined her plate, then his, and pointed at his eggs with her fork. You have to eat them while they're warm. Cold eggs are sad eggs. You've mentioned food having feelings before, he said. Because it's true, she said simply, and began eating. He picked up his fork. Across the table, Aveline was watching him over the rim of her coffee cup with an expression that was almost a smile, private and unhurried. The smile of a woman who was allowing herself one unguarded moment before the day required her to be something more strategic. He looked at his eggs. He ate them while they were warm. After breakfast, Camille took her bucket to the far corner of the room and began an architecture project of considerable ambition shells arranged in clusters on the floor, lines traced between them, a small stone at the center of each formation like a town square. Aveline refilled the coffee and sat back down. Tell me about before, Yisul said. She looked at him. Before Korea, before the English classes, before the go bag and the crisis instincts and the ability to clear 43 families before 7 in the morning. He paused. Before whatever it was that made you look at me across a beach and send your daughter over instead of walking the other direction. She was quiet for a moment. The coffee cup turned slowly in her hands. I worked for the U.S. government, she said. Crisis negotiation, hostage recovery, 12 years. A pause. I was good at it. The kind of good that means they send you to the worst situations because they trust you not to break. Until you did. She looked at him. Not surprised that he had said it, acknowledging that he had read it correctly. A school, she said. 17 children. We had a good plan. Someone changed a variable without telling me, and I was mid-negotiation when it collapsed. Her voice remained even throughout the voice of someone who had told this story enough times in their own head that they could present it without flinching. 4 children didn't come home. The kitchen held the weight of that. I walked out of the debrief and never went back, she said. I came here because nobody knew my name. Because Camille deserved a mother who was present instead of one who was always half inside a crisis somewhere. She paused. And because I needed to find out if I could build something instead of just preventing things from burning. He thought about the 43 families, the grandmother with the after-school program, the trust that had held without explanation at 6 in the morning. You found out, he said. Yes. Her eyes met his directly. So could you. He looked at her. Power that protects is harder than power that controls, she said. It's slower, less certain. It doesn't announce itself. She paused. But it compounds. Every person who trusts you becomes someone who extends that trust to the next person. It builds something that doesn't require you to be in the room for it to hold. She looked at him steadily. What you've built required you to be the most frightening thing in every room you've ever entered. That's exhausting. A beat. And you are exhausted. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. Across the room, Camille held up her shell arrangement. Look, she said. I made a city. They both looked. It was intricate and deliberate clusters connected by careful lines, a stone at the center of each one. What are the stones for? Yisul asked. The safe places, she said, as though this were obvious. Every city needs them. Otherwise, people have nowhere to go when things get hard. She looked at him with the direct simplicity of a child who had not yet learned to say important things indirectly. Does your city have safe places? He looked at the small stones. He thought about what his city had. What he had built inside it, what it had cost the people who lived in the spaces between his operations, the clinic in Yongsan, the buildings in Mapogu, the ordinary lives that had absorbed the pressure of his world without ever being asked if they consented to it. Not enough, he said quietly. Camille nodded seriously. Then that's what you should build next. Across the table, Aveline said nothing, but her hand, resting on the table between them, moved almost imperceptibly, almost nothing a fraction closer to his. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them moved away. Tay arrived at noon with a black duffel bag and the face of a man carrying something heavier than its weight suggested. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony and stepped back. His eyes moved to Aveline briefly, the careful assessment of a man recalibrating who was allowed to be in certain rooms, then back to Yisul. Yisul unzipped the bag. 7 cloth-bound notebooks. A hard drive wrapped in cloth. And beneath everything a sealed envelope with his name written in handwriting he recognized immediately and had not seen in 4 years. His predecessor. The man who had handed him the syndicate at 19 years old like it was a birthright rather than a burden. The man who had died quietly in a private hospital in Busan 18 months ago without ever having the conversation Yi-Sol had always assumed was coming. He stared at the envelope, set it aside. Notebooks first. Aveline settled Camille in the back bedroom with her tablet, a negotiated portion of fruit, and firm instructions. The door closed. The kitchen reduced itself to the two of them, and the open notebooks and the afternoon light moving slowly across the table. They worked in silence initially, Yi-Sol reading, Aveline cross-referencing on the laptop, building the picture the way you build any picture, one verified detail at a time. He had expected her to ask questions. She didn't. She read what she was given, found the threads worth pulling, and pulled them without narration. It was, he thought, the most efficient he had ever shared a workspace with anyone. The numbers told their story with the flat precision of things that have never needed to perform. 15 years of syndicate operations recorded in handwriting so consistent it was almost mechanical. Protection fees from businesses across 4 districts. Payments to officials, police, judiciary. The financial architecture of a world that ran parallel to the visible city, same streets, same buildings, different rules. He had known most of it, had lived inside the construction of it. What he had not seen, because he had not looked, was the column in different ink that ran alongside the payments. A notation system small, precise, coded but not impenetrably so. He decoded it slowly. Businesses that had closed after refusing payment. Families displaced when properties were acquired for syndicate use. A community health clinic in Yongsan, 3 notations spanning 8 months that had lost its operating funding when its director filed a report with the wrong authorities. A union organizer in Incheon. 1 entry, 1 date, nothing after it. He turned the page. "Stop," Aveline said quietly. He looked up. She was watching his face with the focused attention he had come to recognize, reading him the way she read everything, systematically and without performance. "You've gone somewhere," she said. "Come back." He looked down at his hands on the open page, at the notation beside the clinic entry, at the date beside the union organizer's name that had nothing after it. "How much of this did you know?" she asked. The negotiator's voice precise, without accusation, designed to open rather than close. "The fees, the payments, the officials." He paused. "Some of the rest. Not all of it." He looked at the clinic notation. "Not this. But you built the structure that made it possible." "Yes." She nodded once. "That matters that you can say that without qualification. Men who can't acknowledge what they built spend the rest of their lives handing it to someone else and calling that progress." She paused. "Is that what you were going to do? Before the beach?" The question found something accurate. He had been building an exit for months, quieter than Shin's, cleaner, but the same fundamental architecture. Step back, transfer authority, tell himself the syndicate would evolve without him into something less corrosive. Tell himself that distance was the same thing as accountability. "Yes," he said. And now, he looked at the notation beside the clinic, at the families displaced, at the date that ended without continuation. "Now I want to know what it costs to answer for it," he said. They worked through the afternoon. At some point, Tay appeared in the doorway with food he had brought from somewhere nearby and set it on the counter without interrupting. At some point, Camille emerged, assessed the situation with her characteristic gravity, collected a portion of food, and returned to the bedroom. The light moved across the table and changed color, and the notebooks gave up their contents page by page. At 6 in the evening, Yi-Sol opened the envelope. He read it once, set it flat on the table, sat back. Aveline waited. "He knew," Yi-Sol said. "The man who built this, he knew exactly what it was." His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual architecture. "He kept these records for whoever came after him. He writes..." He stopped. "What does he write?" she asked. Yi-Sol looked at the letter, at the careful hand of a man who had spent his last years with something unresolved pressing against him from the inside. "He says the ledgers were never a record," he said. "He says they were an apology." A pause. "He just never found anyone to give it to." The kitchen was very still. Aveline looked at him across the table, across the open notebooks and the documented wait of 15 years, and the letter from a dead man who had spent his life building something he knew was wrong and had left behind the only form of honesty he could manage. "You found someone," she said. He looked at her. Outside, the city moved through its evening indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware that inside a narrow building in Mapogu, a man was holding a dead man's apology and deciding, slowly and without certainty, whether he had the right to deliver it. Aveline's hand was resting on the table between them. This time he didn't look away from it. This time slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man performing an action he cannot take back, and has decided to perform anyway. He set his hand beside hers. Not touching. Just beside. Close enough that the distance between them was a choice rather than a fact. She looked down at his hand next to hers. She didn't move away. Outside the window, Sol kept going, as it always did, as it always would, bright and indifferent and continuous. Inside the kitchen, neither of them spoke. The notebooks lay open between them, and the letter lay flat, and the light had gone the deep gold of early evening, and somewhere in the back bedroom, a small girl was constructing something elaborate and important out of shells, building, as she always was, a city with safe places at the center. The invitation went out at midnight, handwritten, syndicate letterhead, the specific formality that transformed a meeting from a suggestion into an obligation, the kind of summons that carried the Elder Council's authority behind it, like a blade behind glass. To refuse it was to declare yourself. To attend was to walk into whatever had been prepared. Shin would know it was a trap. He would come anyway, because refusing meant the council would ask why, and the why would open everything Shin had spent 18 months carefully closing. He had no move that didn't involve sitting at this table. Yisol was counting on that. The estate in Seongbuk-dong had been in his possession for 11 years, and had hosted exactly 3 meetings of any significance. It was not a place he brought people to impress them. It was a place he brought people when he needed them to understand, without being told directly that they were operating inside a space that belonged entirely to him. The dining room held a table that seated 20. He had it set for 8. Tae supervised with the focused grimness of a man who understood that every detail tonight was a variable and variables needed to be controlled. White linen pressed without a crease. Good glassware, not ostentatious, simply correct. Food that had been properly prepared by someone who knew what they were doing. Yisol stood at the head of the table and looked at the empty chairs. He thought about a beach blanket at sunset, about a small girl who had told him food gets sad when nobody eats it, about the specific quality of sitting with untouched food in front of you while the world you had built sent you its last message. He picked up a glass, turned it once in his hands, and set it back down. He had spent 17 years building rooms that made people afraid. Tonight he was building something different. They arrived in the order he had anticipated. His 2 remaining loyal lieutenants, first men who had chosen him over the council vote, and carried that choice in the set of their shoulders. They sat without ceremony on his right, and said nothing that wasn't necessary. Chairman Wu arrived 8 minutes later. He was 71 years old and moved through rooms the way certain kinds of authority always moved, without announcement, without performance, with the absolute economy of a man who had never needed to demonstrate what he was because everyone in every room he had ever entered already knew. He examined the dining room when he entered, noted the table, noted the food, noted Yisol's posture at its head. He sat down across from the lieutenants and folded his hands and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting for various versions of this particular evening for 30 years. Shin arrived last. He came with 2 men and wore his composure like a well-fitted suit, everything in place, nothing visibly strained. He moved down the length of the table with the measured confidence of a man who had decided on the drive over that confidence was the only play left and was executing it with professional commitment. He looked at Yisol. Yisol-si. His voice was even, almost warm. It's been a strange few days. Sit down, Junyu. Something moved behind Shin's eyes at the use of his given name. Just a flicker. He sat. His men positioned themselves behind his chair. Yisols were already in the room, had been since 2 hours before the first guest arrived, occupying the corners and the doorways with the stillness of furniture that breathes. Chairman Wu looked between the 2 men at opposite ends of the table with the mild, devastating attention of someone watching something he had seen before and knew the shape of. You called this meeting under council protocol, he said to Yisol. You have something to present. I do. Tae moved. A bound document appeared before Chairman Wu, then before each person at the table. Shin looked at his without touching it, the specific stillness of a man assessing an object he suspects is dangerous. 15 years of syndicate financial records, Yisol said, complete and verified, including 18 months of unauthorized transactions conducted without council knowledge. He paused not for drama, but because the next words required precision. Funds redirected through shell companies for personal gain. Properties acquired using syndicate capital. A private security firm whose clients include 3 sitting council members. Another pause. And a payment made 3 weeks ago to a contracted shooter from Busan. That shooter discharged a weapon on a public beach. The targets were myself and 2 civilians, an American national and her 5-year-old daughter who had no connection to syndicate business. The room was very quiet. Chairman Wu had opened the document. He read without expression the focused, unhurried reading of a man building a complete picture before he responds to any part of it. Shin's composure held. His hands had moved from the table to his lap. "These are fabrications," he said, measured, certain, the work of a man the council has already voted to remove. "The original ledgers are in Chairman Wu's possession," Yusol said, "delivered this morning by a third party with no syndicate affiliation, verified independently." He looked at Shin directly. "You had 48 hours to find and destroy them. You didn't know they existed." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence. Shin's eyes moved just slightly, just for a moment, with the specific involuntary shift of a man whose internal calculation has just returned an unexpected result. Chairman Wu set the document down. He looked at Shin with the mild, patient attention of a man who has already decided and is observing formalities out of respect for the process rather than uncertainty about the outcome. "The council will conduct a full review of these records," he said. "Until that review is complete, all authority and operational activity is suspended." He folded his hands. "For everyone at this table, Chairman," Shin began. "Everyone," Wu said. The word was quiet and without edges because it had no need of them. Shin sat back. The performance of confidence had gone thin in the way that performances go thin when the audience has stopped believing the structure still present, but the substance gone, like a building after a fire. He looked at Yisul across the length of the table, and something passed between them that was not quite hatred and not quite respect, and was perhaps the particular acknowledgement of two men who had known each other long enough to recognize. When a thing was finished, "You could have come for me directly," Shin said. Low, almost private. "You have the men. You've always had the men." "I know," Yisul said. "Then why this?" A gesture, the table, the documents, the chairman, all of it. Yisul looked at the white linen, at the good glassware, at the food that had been served and eaten because he had told Tay to serve it regardless, because he had decided that men could share a table and still be held accountable and that one did not preclude the other. He thought about a woman who had told him that power which protects is harder to build than power which controls. He thought about small stones at the center of shell cities. "Because a massacre leaves things behind that can't be cleaned up," he said quietly. "And I'm done leaving things behind." Shin held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. It was, Yisul understood, the only concession he was ever going to get. Not an admission, not remorse, just the looking away of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. It was enough. Chairman Wu stood and gathered his document with the unhurried precision of a man concluding a meeting that had gone exactly as long as it needed to. "I'll be in touch," he said to the room. "Don't go anywhere." He left. The room exhaled. Tay appeared in the doorway with a question in his posture. Yisul looked at him and gave the smallest shake of his head. "No blood tonight." He sat alone at the head of the table after the others had filed out, and the room had returned to its silence, and the candles had burned down to their last half-inch. He sat with his hands flat on the white linen and looked at the good glassware and the remains of a meal that had been shared by men who might have killed each other and hadn't. Somewhere across the city, Aveline was putting Camille to bed in the hotel room Tay had arranged. He wondered if Camille had her bucket. He picked up his glass. He finished what was in it. He set it down carefully on the white linen and sat for a long time in the quiet of a room where nothing had been destroyed tonight. It was, he was discovering, a different kind of feeling from winning. Quieter, less certain, and underneath the uncertainty something that felt, cautiously and without announcement, like the first hesitant breath of something clean. The council's review took 6 days. Yisul spent them in the safe house with his laptop, and the particular discipline of a man who has decided on a direction and is moving toward it without looking back. Reports came in, were read, were filed. The city outside the window continued its ordinary business, indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware of the quiet earthquake redistributing the weight of things inside its walls. On the 3rd day, Shin was formally suspended. Yisul read the notification, set it aside, and kept working. On the 5th day, 2 of Shin's Busan associates were taken into custody by prosecutors acting on an anonymous financial disclosure that had arrived simultaneously at 3 separate offices, different jurisdictions. No apparent connection between the tips. The documentation so clean and complete that the investigators had nothing to do but follow where it led. Yisul had sent it himself. No intermediary, no leverage extracted in return, no name attached to the source. Just the truth, released into the world without asking anything back from it. He sat with that feeling for a moment after he confirmed the arrests. It was unfamiliar, lighter than satisfaction, quieter than victory. The specific feeling of a door being closed that had been open for a very long time, letting in a draft he had stopped noticing years ago. He noticed its absence now. Aveline called on the fourth day. He picked up before the second ring, was briefly and privately annoyed at how quickly he had moved. "Camille wants to know if you're eating," she said. Something shifted in his chest at the sound of her voice, small and involuntary and entirely inconvenient. "Tell her yes." "Are you actually?" A pause. Mostly. Silence that carried the shape of a smile without confirming it. "She's been working on something for you," Aveline said. 2 days. She won't tell me what it is. She says it's private between her and her friend. Her friend. He sat with those 2 words longer than he intended. "When the council clears the suspension," he said. "A few more days. Then it's safe. We're fine where we are." "I know." He paused. "I just want it to be safe before she's out in the city again." A beat of quiet. Then, "Yisol." "What?" "She hasn't had a single nightmare." Her voice was quieter now. The strategic register set aside something more direct underneath it. "She told me yesterday that she's not scared because her friend with the sad eyes is fixing everything." A pause that held more than it showed. "I thought you should know what you mean to her." "Already." He sat very still in the kitchen. "I'll call when it's clear," he said. He hung up and remained at the table for a long time, his hands flat on the surface, the city going about its afternoon outside the window, and something moving through him slowly that he had no efficient language for. On the 6th day, he wrote his resignation. 1 page, formal, precise. The language the council required: operational disruption, leadership continuity, long-term viability, clean professional sentences that said what they needed to say without excess. At the bottom, below what protocol required, he added 1 line: "It is also my assessment that this organization, in its current form, should not continue." He submitted it before he could revise it. Chairman Wu called within the hour. "This is permanent," the old man said. "Not a question, not an objection, just confirmation, the verification of a man who needed to know the thing he was receiving was the real thing." "Yes," Yisol said. A silence. Long enough to contain 30 years of watching this world take people apart. Then quietly, in a voice that carried something Yisol hadn't expected from him, "Good." Simply that. The line went dead. The transfers took 2 days and required the kind of precise, unhurried attention that left no room for doubt or revision. The shell company properties, the community space, the youth center, the residential buildings in Mapogu and Yongsan moved into a community trust established under a holding entity with no traceable connection to his name. The attorney asked nothing. He was paid accordingly. The legitimate business proceeds followed: restaurants, an import company, the logistics firm in Busan, redirected to the trust. Not everything the ledger's notations demanded. A fraction of the full debt. But a fraction was a beginning, and he had never begun before. He burned the phones on the 7th morning. All 6 of them, one at a time, in the kitchen sink. He watched each one curl and blacken and reduce itself, and thought about what it had carried: the messages, the instructions, the network of communication that had been the nervous system of everything he had built. The last one he held for a moment before he dropped it in. He thought about the text that had started everything. 18. "The vote is 7-2. You're out, Yisolsi. Don't be there when the sun goes down." He had not been there. He had been on a beach with untouched food and a child who believed food had feelings. He dropped the phone. Tay appeared in the doorway. "Done?" he asked. "Done." Tay was quiet, the quiet of 15 years recalibrating itself into something new. "Then, I want to open a restaurant." Yisol looked at him. He had not smiled genuinely, unguardedly, from somewhere real in longer than he could accurately calculate. He smiled now. "I'll invest," he said. Legitimately. Tay's expression did something it rarely did. It relaxed completely, all at once, into the face of a man who had just been given permission to want something simple. "I know," Tay said. "I already planned on asking." Yizul picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Outside the safe house window, Seoul was doing what it always did: bright, continuous, indifferent, extraordinary in its ordinariness. A city full of people getting through their days, building things, feeding each other, sitting together at tables. Kang Yisul walked out the door. He left behind, in the kitchen sink, the last physical evidence of everything he had been. Ahead of him, the city opened up, familiar and entirely new, and somewhere inside it, a small girl in a yellow dress was waiting with something she had made with her hands and had decided, with the absolute authority of a child who has already chosen, belonged to him. He had somewhere to be. For the first time in 17 years, he was walking toward something instead of away from it. The difference, he was discovering, was everything. The park was in Mapogu. Small and unhurried, a convenience store on one corner, a florist on the other, benches along a path where elderly men played badook in the afternoon light, and children ran ahead of their parents with the boundless conviction that the path would hold them. Cherry trees lined the far edge, their branches still bare but carrying if you looked carefully. If you were the kind of person who had learned to look for things that were just beginning the first faint suggestion of buds, the hesitant green of something deciding to return, he sat on a bench near the path and waited. Plain dark trousers, a simple jacket, nothing that announced anything to anyone. No car at the curb with an engine running. No Tay at a measured distance with his hand near his waistband. No phone burning with the weight of other people's emergencies. Just a bench. Just the park. Just an ordinary Tuesday morning doing what ordinary Tuesday mornings do, proceeding without drama, without significance, without any acknowledgement of the fact that for the man sitting on the bench near the path, it was the first morning in 17 years that belonged entirely to him. It felt profoundly strange. It also felt beneath the strangeness, underneath the unfamiliarity of a silence that contained no threat like the first breath after a very long time underwater. He heard her before he saw her. Her voice carried across the park with the bright, uninhibited confidence of a child who has not yet learned that public spaces require volume management, a running commentary on everything she was passing. The dog on the lead was discussed at length. The man with the bicycle received a thorough assessment. The cherry trees were addressed directly and informed, with complete authority, that she knew they were getting ready and she was watching. Then she cleared the bend in the path and saw him. She stopped. Just stopped. Completely. Standing in the middle of the path with her red bucket in one hand and the morning light catching her braids and her yellow dress bright against the gray-green of the waking park. She looked at him across the distance between them. He watched her face move through something recognition, then something warmer and more complicated than recognition, something that resolved itself finally into an expression so open and uncomplicated and luminous that it moved through him like the first note of something he had forgotten was music. She ran. He had enough time to brace. She hit the bench at full speed and climbed up beside him with the complete physical certainty of a child who has already determined she is welcome, who has, in fact, never considered the alternative. She settled herself, smoothed her dress with both hands, and looked up at him with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Did you?" "Yes, absolute. I told my mom the night before. I said he'll be there." She said. A small pause, a child's pause, the pause of someone quoting something important. She said she hoped so too. She swung her feet against the bench. She packed extra food, just in case you needed convincing. He looked up. Aveline was coming along the path at her own pace, unhurried, a canvas bag over one shoulder, her hair down the way it had been in the safe house kitchen on that first gray morning. She was wearing something simple, nothing strategic, and she moved through the ordinary morning of the park with an ease that was different from the composed control he had first catalogued on the beach. Lighter. Not unguarded. He didn't think she was capable of unguarded, and he understood that entirely because neither was he. But lighter, as though she had set something down somewhere between the beach and this bench and had not gone back for it. She reached them and looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them, unhurried and unspoken, and carrying the full weight of everything that had happened since a small girl sat down uninvited on a beach blanket and asked a man who hadn't touched his food why he wasn't eating. "You look better," she said. "You look—" He stopped himself, looked at the path. The corner of her mouth moved. She sat down on his other side, and the three of them occupied the bench together, Camille between them, her bucket on her lap, her feet swinging, and for a moment nobody said anything, and the park went about its business around them, and it was, Yisul thought, the most ordinary moment he had experienced in recent memory. He had not understood, until now, how much he had missed ordinary. Camille had been building toward something. He could tell from the way she was holding the bucket carefully, with both hands, with the specific reverence of someone transporting something that matters. She had been waiting since she sat down, letting him settle, giving him time with the instinctive courtesy of a child who understood, without being taught it directly, that some people need a moment before they can receive something. She turned to him now. "This is yours," she said. She held the bucket toward him with both hands and enormous gravity. "I made it. It took 2 days and my mom had to help with the glue part, but the rest is mine." He reached in carefully. A shell large pale white, a faint spiral of pink threading through its center. smooth from long acquaintance with the ocean and from 2 days of small, careful hands. Around its base, smaller shells fixed in a careful, deliberate circle, at the very top, held in place with what appeared to be a truly extraordinary quantity of craft glue. The striped stone from the safe house floor. He turned it in his hands, felt the weight of it, the care in it. "It's a house," Camille said. Her voice was serious and certain and entirely gentle. "For when you feel empty inside. My mom says everyone needs somewhere that's just theirs." She pointed at the striped stone with one small finger. "That part is so you remember." "Remember what?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him with the direct, patient simplicity of a child delivering something true. "That you stayed," she said. "Most people who get sad like that, they leave. They go somewhere nobody can find them, and they stay sad by themselves." She paused. "But you stayed, and you fixed it." She looked at the stone. "That's what the stone is for. So when you forget, and my mom says everyone forgets, sometimes you can look at it and remember that you're the kind of person who stays." He looked at the shell in his hands, the stone at the top, the careful circle of smaller shells, the work of 2 days and small hands and a child who had decided, with the complete and unconditional authority of someone who loves without reservation, that he was worth the making of it. Something moved through him, slow and deep, and without a name he had words for, yet not the splinter-sharp pain of the car ride or the kitchen or the ledger notations. Something different, something that felt, cautiously and without announcement, like the specific relief of a wound that has finally been properly tended. He looked up. Aveline was watching him with those steady eyes, not the analytical watch of the beach or the safe house or the negotiator's careful assessment. Something quieter, something that was allowing itself, in this unremarkable park on this ordinary Tuesday, to simply be present without strategy or calculation or the careful management of what it showed. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had carried a great deal for a long time and had found here, in this moment, on this bench, that she didn't have to carry all of it right now. He understood that feeling completely. It was new to him too. They ate without hurry. Aveline unpacked the canvas bag, kimbap, strawberries, juice boxes, and a pair of chopsticks she set beside his portion without comment. He noted that she had brought them. He noted that she had done it deliberately. He noted that he was glad she had and did not examine that gladness too closely because it was too new and too unguarded, and he was still learning how to hold things like that without closing his hand around them. Camille finished eating with efficient satisfaction and climbed down from the bench and went to investigate the cherry trees, talking to them in the low, serious, consultative tone she used for things she respected, moving from branch to branch with her bucket, occasionally holding a shell up to the light as though offering the tree a gift. He watched her. "She's going to be extraordinary," he said. "She already is," Aveline said, quietly, with the specific warmth of a woman stating something she has known for a long time and never gets tired of knowing. A pause settled between them, easy and unhurried, the pause of two people who have run out of the need to fill silence. "What do I call you now?" she asked. "You said the name was gone." "I'm working on the next one. How does that feel?" He thought about it, gave it the honest consideration it deserved rather than the efficient answer. "Like standing in a room after all the furniture has been moved out," he said. "Everything familiar is gone. The space is larger than I expected." He paused. "I keep reaching for things that aren't there anymore." She nodded slowly. "I know that room," she said. "I lived in it for 2 years after I left the government." She looked at the path ahead of them, at the Baduk players, the children, the dog on its lead, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday. It gets less empty. Not because you fill it with the same things, because you find out what actually belongs in it. A pause. That takes time. But it happens. He looked at her. How much time? She turned to meet his eyes, and something in her expression shifted, opened, slightly, carefully, the way things open when they have decided to trust the space they're in. "Different for everyone," she said. But, a pause, smaller than the others, intimate in its smallness. "It helps not to do it alone." The words settled between them like the stone on the shell, deliberate and carefully placed and carrying the full weight of what they meant. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away, and his hand, resting on the bench between them, moved just slightly, just barely, the smallest possible motion toward hers. She looked down at it. Then she turned her hand over slowly, without drama, with the quiet certainty of a woman who has assessed a situation and made her decision, and her fingers found his. Not urgently, not with the performed significance of a moment that knows it is a moment. Just simply, the way two people hold on when they have both been through a great deal and have found, against considerable odds, and on an ordinary Tuesday in a park in Mapogu, that they don't have to let go. Across the park, Camille had found it one single cherry blossom on the lowest branch, weeks ahead of all the others, improbable and small and absolutely certain of itself, holding its color against the bare wood of the branch like a quiet declaration. She turned around with her whole face lit up. "Mama," she called across the park, her voice carrying the pure, uncontained astonishment of a child encountering a miracle that has arrived exactly when expected. "It's awake. I told you it was getting ready. I told you." Aveline laughed fully, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has set her armor down and found that the ground beneath it is solid. She turned, and the laugh was still in her face when she looked at Yusol, and the warmth of it reached him like the first morning sun after a season of cold. He looked at her face, in the ordinary light of an ordinary Tuesday, at the woman who had sent her daughter across a beach toward the most dangerous man in the city, because she had read him at 30 meters and trusted what she found, who had sat in his kitchen at 2 in the morning and held the truth of the ledgers without looking away, who had cleared 43 families before sunrise and redirected a dead man's apology toward something living, who was holding his hand on a bench in a park while their daughter narrated the waking of the cherry trees. He thought briefly, carefully, with the particular precision of a man who does not yet fully trust good things, but is learning that this was what it felt like to be in the right place. Not safe, not certain, not finished, or resolved, or arrived at anything final. Just right, like a knot that has been pulled tight for 17 years, releasing all at once into something that could, with time and patience and the continued presence of certain people, become something that resembled ease. "Eat your kimbap," Aveline said. He looked down at his plate. Then quietly, without ceremony, in a park in Mapogu on a Tuesday morning, with cherry trees waking, and a child narrating miracles, and a woman's hand warm in his, Kang Yisol ate his food. All of it. And for the first time in 17 years, nothing on the table went sad.